Shalom. Thanks for joining me. I'm in chapter 7 and of Matthew, and I'm going to begin in verse 13. This is a section called the narrow and the wide gates. There's a couple of interesting things in here that are good to notice. The narrow and the wide gates. And remember, this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus is teaching his disciples how to follow him. He's basically explaining to them the ethics of kingdom living. And what he is saying in here, first of all, let me go back and just say this. The heart of the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, where Jesus says, your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. And so here's another example of the way in which our righteousness exceeds that. The righteousness that Jesus is talking about is righteousness that comes from our heart. Our obedience to him and our following him comes from our heart, not from our obedience to external rules and regulations, because that's not what makes us righteous. Instead, it is the way we love him in our heart. And now he talks about an interesting thing. He talks about these two streets and two gates. There's in verse 13 and 14 of just these two verses, he says this: enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So there's this narrow road and a narrow gate, and there's a wide and broad road and a wide and broad gate. The narrow road is harder to walk on, and it's more difficult to find. And that gate is harder to go through. It's more constrained. It's more difficult. But that pathway leads to a type of life that Jesus says in the Greek is the word zoe. And there's two types of words in the Greek for life. There's the word bios, B-I-O-S, from which we get the word biology, bios, biological. That means life. That means biological life. In other words, something is alive. Versus another type of life called zoe, Z-O-E, zoe, which is the zest of life, the fullness of life, getting life and really living it. The full, sometimes referred to as the full and meaningful life. There's two kinds of life: just bios, living, surviving, versus life that is meaningful and full of the zest of life, Zoe life. Jesus said, if you walk this narrow path, it's a harder path to walk on. It's much more constrained. It's much more difficult. In fact, the gate that gets you through there to that pathway is even harder to get through. Few people find it, but the ones that do find it, they're the ones that get to experience the zest of life, the full and meaningful life. The other pathway is broad, it's wide, it's easy to walk on, easy to find. Everybody can find that one easily without any effort. And the gate that you walk through is such an easy gate. There's no strain whatsoever to open the gate and walk through it. It's broad, it's wide. But that gate, he says, leads to something called destruction. And in the Greek, it's an interesting word. It's the word that means to be disassembled. To be torn apart, and it carries with it a connotation of being publicly embarrassed, publicly ruined, publicly destroyed. So this easy road, the one that everybody can find without any effort, takes no effort whatsoever to walk on it. Ultimately, it leads you to a point where you are publicly ruined, publicly embarrassed. But the narrow road, the harder road to walk on, the road that's not easy to find, the road that's harder to stay on, that's the road that will lead you to the zestful living, full and meaningful living. Now, what he's saying to us is following him is not as easy as you think it is. Following him has to come from your heart, which means I have to take the desires of my heart and set them aside and replace them with the desires of his heart in me. I have to follow him wholeheartedly, and I have to set myself aside in order to do so. And that's not an easy thing to do. But when I do that, I find that the life I will live is a life of full and meaningfulness and worth living. And that's what Jesus is saying. And he is telling you and asking you and inviting you, follow him on the narrow road. It's harder, but it's worth it.